the patriarch who shared his own wife with his son. The cruelest story from Kentucky. In the mist-shrouded hollows of eastern Kentucky, where secrets as old as the ancient trees themselves are cradled by the Appalachian Mountains, there once existed a family whose bloodline became so tangled its consequences would echo for generations. This is the disturbing chronicle of the Blackwood family, whose isolated existence in Shadow Creek Hollow during the 1950s concealed practices defying both nature and law. Within the remote valleys of Harlan County, far from prying eyes and civilized judgment, stood the weathered Blackwood homestead. The property spanned nearly 50 acres of dense woodland and small tobacco fields. It had remained in the family's possession since the Civil War, to the casual observer. The main house's peeling white paint and the scattered outbuildings might have suggested nothing more than rural poverty, but horrors that few could imagine were contained within the walls of that home. The year was 1953 when local authorities first began to suspect something was terribly wrong within the Blackwood family. It started with rumors at the general store in the nearest town, 15 miles away. Whispers about strange-looking children who never attended school, about a woman who seemed to age before her time, about a patriarch whose iron grip controlled not just his land but the very souls dwelling upon it. Elias Blackwood, 52, ruled his domain with unquestioned authority, standing 6 feet tall with shoulders as broad as an oak beam. His weathered face bore the deep lines of a man who had spent his life battling both the elements and his own demons. His voice, when he chose to use it, carried a weight of command that brooked no argument. When Elias spoke, the family obeyed without question. Elias wasn't just the head of that family, recalled former County Sheriff Thomas Wilson in a 1972 interview. He was like their god. What he said was law, and nobody, not his wife, not his children, dared to question him. At the center of this tragic tale was Martha Blackwood, who had arrived at the homestead as a bride of 16 in 1938 when Elias was 37. Martha came from a neighboring county, the daughter of a failed farmer who traded her hand in marriage to settle a debt. Photographs recovered from the property show a once beautiful young woman with dark hair and eyes that sparkled with life, a sparkle that would dim with each passing year until it was extinguished entirely. By 1953, Martha was 31 years old but appeared much older. Neighbors who occasionally saw her on rare trips into town described a woman who seemed hollow inside, whose gaze never met another's, whose voice had been reduced to a whisper. She had borne 6 children, 4 of whom survived. But it was the peculiar relationship between Martha, Elias, and their eldest son, James, that would ultimately expose the dark secret of Shadow Creek Hollow. James Blackwood, born in 1939, grew into a young man who seemed a shadow of his domineering father. Where Elias was loud and commanding, James was quiet and watchful. Yet beneath that quiet exterior burned something disturbing, something that had been carefully cultivated by his father. What made this case so uniquely disturbing, explained Dr. Eleanor Simmons, who studied the psychological aspects of isolated Appalachian communities during the 1960s, wasn't just the genetic implications. It was the deliberate way in which Elias indoctrinated his son into this arrangement, grooming him from an early age to accept this perversion of family bonds as normal. A horrifying arrangement that had developed within the Blackwood home was revealed in court records from 1954, beginning when James was just 14 years old. Elias had instituted what he called family sharing, forcing Martha to accept both father and son as conjugal partners. This arrangement continued for years, resulting in 3 children whose parentage remained disturbingly ambiguous. Were they James's siblings or his children? The truth might never have come to light if not for the courage of 15-year-old Sarah Blackwood, the eldest daughter, who managed to escape the property in April 1953, walking nearly 20 miles through rugged terrain. She reached the town of Pineville, where she collapsed at the steps of the local church, malnourished and traumatized. "I still remember that day," said Reverend Howard Jenkins in his memoir. "This child, barely more than skin and bones, looked up at me with eyes that had seen things no child should ever witness. And she said 7 words I'll never forget: "Please don't make me go back there." Sarah's testimony would eventually lead to one of the most shocking legal cases in Kentucky's history. But before authorities could act, tragedy would strike the Blackwood homestead, cementing this case in the annals of Kentucky's darkest chapters. Make sure you're already subscribed to this channel if you value the historical truth that society tries to suppress. Even when it's uncomfortable, this channel is your only window into these forgotten tragedies that shaped American communities. The isolation of the Blackwood family wasn't merely geographic. It was deliberately cultivated by Elias over decades. Former neighbors recalled how the family gradually withdrew from community life in the years following World War II. Elias stopped attending the local church, pulled his children from the small schoolhouse, and began turning visitors away at gunpoint. That property became like its own little kingdom, recalled Mabel Jenkins, who lived 3 miles from the Blackwood land. Elias put up no trespassing signs everywhere, strung barbed wire along the boundaries. Folks knew better than to go nosing around there. This physical isolation enabled Elias to establish his own twisted version of morality within the family compound. Court documents revealed that he justified his actions through a perverse interpretation of biblical passages, often reading aloud to the family from a Bible in which he had underlined certain verses while completely ignoring others that condemned his behavior. Elias created what we would now call a cult-like environment, explained Dr. Simmons. By controlling all information from the outside world and positioning himself as the sole interpreter of right and wrong, he was able to normalize behaviors that any functioning society would immediately recognize as deeply harmful. The arrangement between Elias, James, and Martha began gradually. James later testified that his father first presented the idea when James was 14, framing it as an initiation into manhood and a Blackwood family tradition. Elias claimed their ancestors had practiced similar arrangements to keep the bloodline strong, a common but dangerous justification in isolated communities. Martha's role in this tragedy remains complex. Survivors' accounts paint a picture of a woman whose will had been systematically broken through years of intimidation and isolation. By the time the arrangement with James began, Martha had already endured over a decade of Elias's domination. Medical examinations conducted after the family's removal from the property indicated signs of long-term physical hardship and malnutrition. "We have to understand Martha as a victim, not an accomplice," insisted Catherine Reynolds, one of the few female social workers in Kentucky during that era. Her entire adult life had been defined by captivity, both physical and psychological. By 1953, her capacity to resist or even recognize alternatives had been methodically destroyed. The other Blackwood children, Sarah, 15, Thomas, 10, and Ruth, 7, grew up witnessing this disturbing family dynamic. Though court records indicate Elias attempted to shield the younger children from the full extent of the arrangement, the psychological impact on these children would prove profound and enduring. Most disturbing were the 3 youngest children, twins Mary and Joseph, 4, and infant Daniel, 1. Genetic testing was not available in the 1950s, making it impossible to determine whether these children were fathered by Elias or James. However, medical examinations conducted after their removal from the property revealed concerning developmental issues. All 3 of the youngest children displayed symptoms consistent with consanguineous parentage, noted Dr. William Fletcher in his 1954 medical report. Reduced cognitive function, distinctive facial features, and, in the case of the twins, congenital heart defects that would require ongoing medical attention. The Blackwood homestead operated as a largely self-sufficient entity. The family grew their own food, raised livestock, and made infrequent trips to town only when absolutely necessary. Elias controlled these excursions, always accompanying family members and monitoring their interactions. Several shopkeepers in Pineville recalled the strange tension that surrounded the Blackwoods during these rare appearances. "Those kids never spoke, never even looked at anybody," remembered Harold Green, who ran the general store. "Martha would hand me a list of supplies, and Elias would count out exact change. No pleasantries, no small talk, and they always parked their truck far from other vehicles, left town the moment their business was done." The family's dwelling itself reflected their deteriorating circumstances. Photographs taken by authorities show a main house with peeling paint and a sagging porch, surrounded by outbuildings in various states of disrepair. Inside, investigators found a home divided into strict territories, with Elias occupying the master bedroom while Martha alternated between that room and a smaller bedroom shared with James. The children slept in a long, narrow room that had once been a covered porch, with thin mattresses laid directly on wooden floors. The house lacked indoor plumbing. Electricity had been disconnected years earlier due to unpaid bills, and heating came solely from 2 wood-burning stoves. It wasn't just physical poverty, noted one social worker's report. It was a poverty of spirit that permeated every corner of that property. These children were being raised without any concept of normal human interaction or healthy relationships. Yet, amidst these bleak conditions, a spark of understanding that their family life was profoundly wrong was somehow maintained by Sarah Blackwood. Through subsequent interviews, it emerged that Sarah had occasionally been allowed to visit a distant aunt when she was younger, providing her brief glimpses of normal family life. These memories, however faded, gave her the courage to eventually flee. As authorities prepared to intervene following Sarah's escape, they were unaware that tensions within the Blackwood home had reached a breaking point. James, now 14 years into the disturbing arrangement with his father and mother, had begun to challenge Elias's authority. What happened next would shock even the most hardened investigators and cement this case as one of Kentucky's darkest family tragedies. By late April 1953, the delicate balance of power within the Blackwood household had begun to shift. James, at 24 years old, had grown increasingly resentful of his father's control. According to Sarah's testimony, arguments between father and son had become more frequent and volatile in the months before her escape. James started saying things like, "They're my children, too, and you can't treat her that way anymore," Sarah later told investigators. "Pa would get real quiet when James talked like that, which scared us more than when he yelled." This growing tension coincided with Martha's deteriorating physical and mental health. Now constantly caught between father and son, Martha had begun to display symptoms of severe psychological distress. She would often sit motionless for hours, staring out windows or rocking in a corner. The youngest children, sensing their mother's withdrawal, became increasingly clingy and fearful. The catalyst for the final confrontation came on May 2, 1953, when 4-year-old Joseph Blackwood fell ill with a high fever. James insisted they needed to take the boy to a doctor in town, while Elias refused, claiming traditional remedies would suffice. Their argument escalated until Elias struck James with a leather belt, something he hadn't done since James had grown to adult size. What followed would later be pieced together from physical evidence and the traumatized accounts of the younger children. James left the main house, retreating to one of the outbuildings. Elias, perhaps sensing a challenge to his authority, followed him. The confrontation that ensued turned physical, with both men using farm implements as weapons. "The scene we found in that barn," recalled Sheriff Wilson, "was something I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy to witness. 2 generations of Blackwood men had nearly destroyed each other. And for what? The right to continue this terrible cycle." When authorities finally arrived at the property on May 5, responding to Sarah's revelations, they found a scene of profound tragedy. Elias was dead from wounds sustained in the fight. James was critically injured and unconscious. Martha was found in a catatonic state, unresponsive to questions or commands. The younger children were hiding in a root cellar where they had apparently been for nearly 3 days, surviving on raw potatoes and collected rainwater. The media coverage that followed was sensationalistic and often cruel. Headlines from regional newspapers demonstrate the lurid fascination with the case, mountain family's shameful secret exposed, and father and son fight to the death over shared wife. If you're feeling the weight of this tragedy in your heart right now, type "some family secret should stay buried" in the comments below. Your words honor the memory of those who suffered in silence for generations in America's forgotten hollows. The removal of the surviving Blackwoods marked the beginning of a complex legal and social services case. James Blackwood was hospitalized for his injuries before being arrested and charged with manslaughter. Martha and the children were placed in state custody, with the younger children eventually assigned to foster homes. The trial that followed became a sensation throughout Kentucky and neighboring states, drawing attention to the conditions of isolated Appalachian communities. Defense attorneys for James attempted to position him as much a victim as a perpetrator. James Blackwood never had a chance at normalcy, argued defense attorney Robert Collins. From his earliest memories, he was taught that this arrangement was natural and proper. By the time he developed the capacity to question it, he was already deeply enmeshed in the situation. Prosecutors, however, emphasized that James had been an adult for several years and had opportunities, however limited, to seek help or remove himself from the situation. They pointed to his willing participation in the arrangement even after reaching maturity. While we can acknowledge the extraordinary circumstances of the defendant's upbringing, stated Commonwealth Attorney Harold Mitchell, we cannot accept that an adult man bears no responsibility for intimate relations with his father's wife, regardless of how that situation originated. The jury deliberated for 3 days before finding James guilty of the lesser charge of voluntary manslaughter. The judge, recognizing the unique circumstances, sentenced him to 10 years with eligibility for parole after 5. In his sentencing statement, Judge William Preston acknowledged the broader failures that had allowed the situation to develop. This court cannot help but observe that the Blackwood tragedy represents not just the moral failure of individuals, but of a community and system that allowed a family to become so isolated and damaged, Preston stated. While justice demands accountability, it also compels us to examine how such circumstances were permitted to exist unchecked for so many years. Martha Blackwood never stood trial. Following extensive psychiatric evaluation, she was deemed incompetent due to severe trauma-induced dissociative disorder. She was committed to Eastern State Hospital in Lexington, where she would remain until her death in 1968. Having never recovered sufficiently to provide a coherent account of her experiences. An uncertain future faced the younger Blackwood children. The twins, Mary and Joseph, with their congenital heart conditions and developmental delays, remained in specialized care facilities. Thomas and Ruth were placed with separate foster families, their ties to each other and their older siblings effectively severed by a system ill-equipped to address their unique needs. Sarah, whose courage had brought the situation to light, faced perhaps the most complex journey of recovery. At 16, she was too old for traditional adoption but too traumatized for independent living. A special arrangement placed her with Reverend Jenkins and his wife, who provided a stable environment while she completed her education. That girl had a strength I've rarely seen in anyone, let alone someone so young, Jenkins later wrote. She carried the weight of her family's salvation on her shoulders, knowing she would be branded by association with their shame. Yet, she never wavered in her conviction that escaping was necessary, not just for herself, but for her siblings. The revelation of the Blackwood case sparked broader investigations into isolated communities throughout Appalachia, uncovering numerous instances of consanguineous relationships, though few as extreme as the Blackwood situation. These findings prompted Kentucky to strengthen its social services presence in rural areas and improve monitoring of school attendance. But for the survivors of Shadow Creek Hollow, these systemic improvements came too late to prevent the damage that would affect them for the remainder of their lives. The consequences of the Blackwood family tragedy extended far beyond the immediate legal proceedings. In the years that followed, the case became a focal point for discussions about rural isolation, the inadequacy of social services in Appalachia, and the genetic consequences of consanguineous relationships. James Blackwood served 5 years and 7 months of his sentence before being paroled in 1959. His re-entry into society was fraught with challenges. The notoriety of the case made employment nearly impossible, and he faced hostility in every community where he attempted to settle. Court records indicate he changed his name multiple times and moved between Kentucky, West Virginia, and Tennessee, never remaining in one location for more than a few months. The tragedy of James Blackwood, reflected parole officer Richard Combs in a 1962 report, is that he became a man without a place in the world. Raised outside society's norms, then rejected by that society when he attempted to join it. His crime cannot be excused, but his existence raises profound questions about rehabilitation in cases where the offender never learned societal expectations in the first place. James ultimately found some measure of stability working on offshore oil rigs in the Gulf of Mexico, where his past was unknown and social interaction was minimal. He died in 1974 from injuries sustained in an industrial accident, having never reconnected with any surviving family members. His death certificate lists no next of kin. For the younger Blackwood children, the long-term outcomes varied dramatically. Medical records from the 1960s showed that both twins, Mary and Joseph, required multiple surgeries for their congenital heart conditions. Despite receiving far better medical care than would have been possible at Shadow Creek Hollow, their developmental delays persisted. Neither ever achieved full independence, eventually transitioning to adult care facilities after aging out of the foster system. Thomas and Ruth, placed with different foster families, experienced divergent paths. Thomas struggled with behavioral issues throughout his adolescence, running away repeatedly and eventually dropping out of school at 16. Court records from the 1960s show multiple arrests for petty crimes, suggesting he never fully adjusted to life outside the isolated environment of his early years. Ruth, however, demonstrated remarkable resilience. Her foster placement with a stable, education-focused family in Lexington provided structure and opportunities her birth family could never have offered. School records indicate she was an above-average student who participated in numerous extracurricular activities. A 1967 follow-up report noted she had enrolled in nursing school, motivated by a desire to help children who can't help themselves. Sarah Blackwood, whose escape had triggered the family's rescue, carried perhaps the heaviest psychological burden. Though physically removed from the abusive environment, she struggled with guilt over her father's death and her siblings' separation. Reverend Jenkins and his wife provided stable support, but recovery was a long and difficult process. Sarah was tormented by an impossible moral equation, recalled Dr. Helen Marshall, who provided counseling to Sarah in the late 1950s. She knew remaining in that situation was untenable. Yet, the consequences of her escape were devastating in different ways. She constantly questioned whether she had made the right choice, whether there might have been some other solution that could have kept her siblings together. Despite these challenges, Sarah gradually built a life for herself. She completed high school in 1956, worked as a secretary while taking evening college courses, and eventually became a social worker specializing in rural family services. Her personal experience informed her professional approach, making her particularly effective at identifying signs of isolation and inappropriate family dynamics. In a rare interview granted to a graduate student researching Appalachian family structures in 1978, Sarah, by then using her married name, which has been withheld to protect her privacy, reflected on the complex legacy of the Blackwood case. What happened to my family wasn't just about individuals making terrible choices. It was about systems failing, communities turning blind eyes, and the danger of isolation. "My father didn't start out as a monster. Something in him broke, and then he broke everyone around him. But it might have been different if someone had intervened years earlier. If there had been regular check-ins from schools or health services. If neighbors had questioned why they never saw the children. The tragedy isn't just what happened, but that it was allowed to happen for so long." Martha Blackwood remained at Eastern State Hospital until her death from pneumonia in 1968. Hospital records indicate she never recovered sufficiently to provide coherent testimony about her experiences, though she occasionally experienced periods of lucidity during which she would ask about her children. Staff, uncertain of how much information would be beneficial, typically provided vague reassurances rather than specific details about their widely scattered circumstances. The infant Daniel, only 1-year-old when removed from the property, represented both the greatest hope and the most profound tragedy of the case. Too young to have conscious memories of the abuse, he had the best chance at a normal life. However, medical examinations revealed significant developmental delays consistent with consanguineous parentage. Additionally, dental and skeletal analyses indicated severe malnutrition during critical developmental periods. Adopted by a couple in northern Kentucky who were never told his full background, Daniel, renamed by his adoptive parents, struggled throughout his education with learning disabilities and social adjustment. His adoptive parents, believing these challenges stemmed solely from early malnutrition, pursued numerous therapies and educational interventions with limited success. The Blackwood children represent a sobering lesson about genetic consequences, explained Dr. Harold Winters, who studied consanguineous relationships in isolated communities during the 1970s. When closely related individuals have children together, the risk of recessive genetic disorders increases dramatically. These children often face lifelong challenges that no amount of intervention can fully address. The physical property at Shadow Creek Hollow remained abandoned for nearly a decade after the family's removal. Local superstition combined with the property's dark history made it unsellable despite its natural resources. In 1962, Harlan County seized the land for unpaid taxes. The main house was demolished and the land was eventually incorporated into Daniel Boone National Forest. Yet, the echoes of the Blackwood tragedy continued to reverberate through Kentucky law and social policy. The case directly influenced the formation of Kentucky's first dedicated Child Protective Services Division in 1955 and led to increased scrutiny of school attendance in rural areas. It also prompted medical outreach programs designed to bring basic health care to isolated communities, reducing their dependence on self-sufficiency in medical emergencies. Today, more than 7 decades after the events at Shadow Creek Hollow, the Blackwood case continues to inform discussions about rural isolation, genetic consequences of consanguinity, and the responsibilities of communities to protect vulnerable members. While the lurid details have faded from public memory, the case remains a significant reference point in academic studies of Appalachian family structures and the development of modern social services. Genetic science has advanced dramatically since the 1950s, providing a much clearer understanding of why consanguineous relationships produce such devastating outcomes. Each of us carries recessive genes for various disorders that remain unexpressed because they're paired with healthy dominant genes from our other parent, explains Dr. Margaret Chun, professor of genetic medicine at the University of Kentucky. When close relatives have children together, the risk of both parents carrying and passing the same problematic recessive genes increases dramatically. This significantly raises the probability of serious genetic disorders that might otherwise occur only rarely in the general population. This scientific understanding wasn't available when the Blackwood children were examined in the 1950s. Doctors could only observe symptoms without fully comprehending their genetic origins. Modern analysis suggests the Blackwood children likely suffered from autosomal recessive disorders, which occur when a child inherits 2 copies of a mutated gene, one from each parent. The social environment that enabled the Blackwood situation has also evolved significantly. Kentucky's hollows are no longer as isolated as they once were, with improved roads, telecommunications, and mandatory reporting laws making it much more difficult for families to completely withdraw from society. School attendance is more rigorously monitored, and healthcare outreach programs regularly serve previously isolated communities. The systems we have in place today make it much harder for a situation like the Blackwoods to develop undetected, explains Dr. Robert Taylor, professor of rural sociology at Eastern Kentucky University. Multiple agencies now have overlapping responsibilities for child welfare, creating a safety net with fewer gaps. While no system is perfect, the kind of multi-generational isolation that enabled the Blackwood tragedy would trigger numerous red flags today. The legal framework surrounding familial relationships has also been strengthened. Kentucky law explicitly prohibits marriage between parent and child or between siblings, with violations classified as felony offenses. While these laws existed in the 1950s, enforcement mechanisms were much weaker, particularly in remote areas where legal authorities had limited presence. The psychological understanding of family dynamics and isolated communities has likewise advanced. Modern research recognizes that isolation itself can become a tool of control, allowing dominant family members to establish alternative moral frameworks without external challenge. What we see in cases like the Blackwoods, notes Dr. Lisa Rodriguez, a forensic psychologist specializing in family systems, is the danger of complete disconnection from community standards. Human beings are social creatures who rely on community feedback to calibrate their moral compass. When that feedback loop is severed, individuals with authoritarian tendencies can establish their own distorted version of normalcy, particularly when they control access to information and resources. Despite these advances, challenges remain in protecting vulnerable individuals in rural communities. Budget constraints often limit the reach of social services, and cultural traditions of privacy and self-sufficiency can make intervention difficult even when problems are suspected. Sarah Blackwood's professional career was devoted to addressing these challenges until her retirement in the 1990s. She worked to develop protocols for identifying at-risk families and creating intervention strategies that respected Appalachian cultural values while ensuring child safety. Her methods emphasized building trust rather than imposing outside standards, recognizing that effective intervention required community cooperation. The Great Tragedy of Isolated Families, she wrote in a 1985 professional journal, isn't just what happens behind closed doors. It's that help often exists just beyond their reach, but mistrust of outsiders prevents them from seeking it. Breaking through that barrier requires patience, respect, and a willingness to understand rather than judge. Of the surviving Blackwood children, only Ruth achieved what might be considered a fully functional adult life. She completed her nursing education, married, and raised 2 children of her own. Conscious of her family history, she underwent genetic counseling before starting her family and remained vigilant about her children's development. She occasionally corresponded with Sarah but maintained distance from her other siblings, finding the connections too painful to sustain. The twins, Mary and Joseph, remained in institutional care throughout their lives, transferred to various facilities as their needs changed. Both died relatively young, Joseph at 32 from complications of his congenital heart condition, and Mary at 38 from pneumonia. Neither ever developed beyond a mental age of approximately 9 years, though caregivers noted they maintained a deep attachment to each other throughout their lives. Thomas's path continued to be troubled. After multiple incarcerations for minor offenses, he eventually found some stability working as a groundskeeper at a state park, a position that minimized social interaction while providing structure. He died in 1987 at age 44, never having married or had children. His death certificate lists cirrhosis as the cause, suggesting alcoholism may have been his method of coping with his traumatic childhood. Daniel, raised without knowledge of his biological family, struggled throughout his life with unexplained health issues and learning disabilities. His adoptive parents' persistent advocacy ensured he received educational support, allowing him to eventually complete vocational training and find employment in a protected workshop environment. He died in 2009 at age 57, never knowing his connection to the Blackwood case. Sarah, the family member who bore witness and sought justice, lived the longest of all the Blackwood children. After retirement, she occasionally spoke at professional conferences about rural family services, though she never publicly identified herself as a Blackwood. She died in 2011 at age 73, leaving behind professional papers that continue to influence rural social work practices throughout Appalachia. The physical traces of the Blackwood family have largely disappeared. The property where Shadow Creek Hollow once stood has been reclaimed by forest, with only foundation stones and a few rusting farm implements remaining to mark human habitation. County records of the case are sealed, accessible only to researchers with specific academic credentials. The graves of Elias, Martha, and those children who have passed away are scattered across Kentucky, most marked with adopted names or simply dates without family identification. Yet, the legacy of the Blackwoods lives on in Kentucky's social service structures, in the academic understanding of isolated communities, and in the ongoing effort to protect vulnerable children from family environments that threaten their well-being. What happened at Shadow Creek Hollow was not merely a family tragedy, but a societal one, a failure of community vigilance and institutional oversight that allowed generations to suffer in isolation. If you've watched until this point, it's because you understand the importance of bringing these hidden histories to light. Leave a comment saying, "I watched until the end, so I can know who truly appreciates the deeper truths of our shared history." Make sure you subscribe to this channel for more untold stories that shaped American communities. Hit that like button if you value historical truth, even when it's uncomfortable. And share this video with someone who appreciates honest examinations of our past. Your support allows us to continue uncovering the forgotten chapters of history that help us understand and improve our present. The story of the Blackwoods reminds us that the most dangerous predators aren't always strangers lurking in shadows, but familiar figures whose power goes unchecked by community oversight. In the hollows and hidden corners of our society, vigilance remains our greatest protection against the darkness that can consume entire families when left to fester in isolation.